the way neurodivergent nervous systems are designed, you're absorbing significantly more stimulation and sensory overload in most experiences, and mostly a large percentage have sensory processing disorders as well. So you're talking about constantly pumping cortisol or adrenaline through the body to try to keep up.
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Janine Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall. Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, joined today by Patrick Casale. Patrick is an ADHD licensed clinical mental health and addictions therapist in Asheville, North Carolina. He is the owner of All Things Private Practice and Resilient Mind Counseling, works as a private practice coach and strategist. His work, and I know this for myself as well, has helped and inspired thousands of mental health professionals to take risks, start and grow their businesses, and invest in themselves. And I'm going to save his official motto for him to share with us later. I love it so much. And I'm so glad to have you here, Patrick. Thanks you so
Janine.
much.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, so today we're going to talk some about neurodivergence. We understand it so much more, and I think that just giving a little of information for people who are newer to understanding about it, it's popping up with a lot of therapists finding that maybe they're having these clients and they don't really know what to do about it. So I think we could have a conversation around that today.
Yeah, I think it's an important conversation to have. I know it's definitely becoming a very popular conversation in terms of social media, content creation, lots of people who are out there really advocating for having neurodivergent affirmative spaces. So really important conversation.
Absolutely. And as, you know, an ADHD person myself, that it's been interesting to see the shift in our society, the way it's looked at. I'm not sure outside of the therapist space so much if it's being, or even maybe outside of the spaces that I'm in, that it's being looked at the way it is. But I know that it's been hugely helpful for me to see so many more people talking about it and acknowledging it and normalizing that it's not really a disorder, it's a different type of brain.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a neurotypical society, right? So when we're talking about neurotypical versus neurodivergent, we're talking about meeting standard milestones of development for neurotypical brain development. And anything that diverges from quote unquote typical, you would start to say is divergent from the typical or the norm. I'd say the big two neurodevelopmental disorders that people talk about the most are autism and ADHD. A lot of the times also comorbid with one another and go hand in hand. And a lot of people we're finding a pretty high prevalency are both autistic ADHD, which makes a lot of sense since a lot of research almost says that it's on the same genotype. So really cool stuff coming out now. I think that 20 years ago, you wouldn't have heard that. You would have heard a lot of outdated, archaic terminology like Asperger's syndrome, still the usage of the language ASD for autism spectrum disorder, lots of stereotypes around both autism and ADHD. So it's good that we are having these conversations.
I agree. And unfortunately, I think there's still plenty of people in our field who are people who do testing and things like that, that maybe are still a little bit old school. I still hear clients saying, oh, I was told that I couldn't be ADHD because I got a college degree or things along those lines, which makes me really hesitant to even refer people for testing. And quite frankly, as an adult, it's not always necessary. I typically with clients will have kind of a long conversation about what are they looking for and is it necessary. It's very expensive. It's another form of gatekeeping. There, unless you have a job where you're trying to get accommodations as an adult, there aren't really a lot of applicable places to have that formal diagnosis.
Yeah. And I think that, if any psychologist or therapist is saying you're quote unquote too high functioning to be ADHD or autistic, that's just another form of ableism. And it's another form of discrimination because what you're saying is that on the outside, your appearance is based on your productivity and your ability to be in the workforce or obtain higher education means that you do not qualify for this diagnosis, which is just one, complete garbage. And two, it's just firmly rooted in this discriminatory mentality of like there's only one way that autism ADHD show up for people. And so when we think about stereotypical ADHD, what do we initially think about as a society? Probably like young white cis het boys who are disruptive, who can't pay attention, who maybe get into a lot of behavioral issues in class. If we think about autism, I know that when I was going through my own discovery, a lot of the internalized ableism that I had was like, I am too high functioning to be autistic. I own multiple businesses. Like when I worked at a group home setting, autistic people were nonverbal. Like all of the things that immediately come to mind, which are just completely and fundamentally untrue. And it's really rooted in our own perception of what different neurotypes present and look like.
Right. And, when we're raised with society giving us those messages, that's the messaging that we believe. And I like to talk to clients about, our society likes to pick what they deem typical, and that's the preferred type of person to be. Like we value extroverts over introverts, even though extroverts typically have a team of introverts behind them, supporting them. People, we tend to prefer early birds versus night owls, although we need the night owls to do the late night shifts for jobs and things like that. But when we're raised with that sort of mentality, you do have to do some work on undoing some of that.
Yep, you do. And it's deeply rooted. And it takes a lot of discovery and education and openness and curiosity too to change stereotypical belief and just the things that feel like societal norms or societal messaging that we kind of have to undo and unpack.
Absolutely. And I think it's lost on a lot of neurotypical people, the damage that does to a person growing up who has a different type of brain that is constantly being told, you're lazy, you're not trying, we expect better of you. And so you grow up with this idea that you're less than. And it takes a lot of work to undo that. And it's a lifelong journey, really.
Yeah, it's a lifelong journey. And it's also a lot of masking in situations to appear quote unquote normal or neurotypical. So whether that be in like social situations, school situations, job situations, having to behave a certain way, communicate a certain way, make direct eye contact, nod your head every time someone's talking, acknowledge facial expressions, small talk is a requirement, all of the things that neurodivergent people really struggle with because of the way the brains have developed. So it is a situation where there is a lot of exhaustion and fatigue and burnout because there's so much energy spent going through day-to-day activities.
Yeah, and that impacts us in ways we're not even aware of. I've always considered myself an extrovert, and the older I get, the more I consider myself an ambivert. But I'm not sure if it's really so much that or that the masking that I do is so exhausting that when I'm with a bunch of people, I can easily talk with people and move around a room and do all the things that our therapist skills teach us to do with people we don't know. But then afterwards, I'm just done. I want to sit in a dark room all by myself and have nobody come and bother me.
Yeah, sensory soothing is really important when we start to talk about unmasking to be able to recharge because the way neurodivergent nervous systems are designed, you're absorbing significantly more stimulation and sensory overload in most experiences. And mostly a large percentage have sensory processing disorders as well. So you're talking about constantly pumping cortisol or adrenaline through the body to try to keep up and ultimately, having this crash effect all the time where you may have to be reclusive, you may become agoraphobic, you may really struggle with major social anxiety, and on top of that, a lot of substance use.
Absolutely. Self-medicating. So that gets lost on a lot of people. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's different ways. It's not always substances that we use to self-medicate. There's all types of addictions and distractions that we can use for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when we're thinking about someone who says, okay, I'm a therapist who, when we were in grad school, we didn't know all the stuff we know now. I really am open to learning. And they might ask, should I be working with neurodivergent clients? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the answer is yes, if you are curious and you do the work. Like you have to, just like expanding your cultural competency and your ability to work with the LGBTQ community safely or members of marginalized communities, the neurodivergent community then is a marginalized community because autism and ADHD are considered to be disabling conditions. So if you're going to work with these populations, you really do have to understand the differences between neurotypical and neurodivergent brain development, communication styles, the ways that people process information, the ways that people communicate. One big entrance into working with the neurodivergent community is like through special interests. So small talk is usually a no-go. So on a standard intake questionnaire when you're doing therapy, like yes, no questions are not really well received. But if you can really get into that person's world through special interests, they'll talk all day. And allowing yourself to give yourself permission to go there with clients. Like if a client comes in and they want to make the whole session 60 minutes about a show that they are really fascinated with or something that they're doing a ton of research on or whatever the special interest is, to be able to go there with them instead of continuously trying to redirect, because what will happen is you'll try to redirect, and that can feel really dismissive to that person when all clinical skills say, no, get back on track. We have to ask question A, B, C, D, and E. And it's like, that's not going to develop a strong therapeutic alliance and relationship in these situations.
I agree. And I noticed for myself once I was kind of beginning my own ADHD journey that I'm not a therapist who does like, let's have 5 minutes of small talk at the beginning of the session. I really just sort of jump right in. Those types of things don't really work with my brain, but I think it can be powerful. I've had people tell me before I had to learn to understand the way you talk, which I didn't understand for a long time. But it can, it can just really, for even neurotypical people, can be really freeing that I'm not going to put you through these ropes or this exercise, but we're going to make this about you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we often lose sight over that in the therapy space of like, this is how I'm supposed to show up, or this is what I'm supposed to do. And there are best practices. There are obviously evidence-based practices, but you have to understand the differentiation in neurotype. And I think that's really important because otherwise there can be really harmful language being used. There can be really harmful expectations. So, if you as the therapist is trying to consistently have your client make eye contact with you, when that is not how they process information safely, that is again going to create a therapeutic rupture. So just allowing for the difference in the way someone's brain has developed so that your therapeutic relationship can be strong and that you can do good work and get deep and really create some healing as well.
Yeah. And so back to this therapist who's saying, okay, I want to learn more about this because I do, and I've heard you and Megan talk about this on your podcast, that you don't necessarily need someone who is really trained in autism or ADHD. You need someone who's curious, who's open to learning, not on the shoulders of your client to teach you. There's so many resources available to do that yourself, but to be affirming and curious and supportive of them. That's very often what we need.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really spot on. Just like any other marginalized group of people, you don't want that marginalized group to do all the heavy lifting for you. So seeking out resources that have been created by neurodivergent clinicians, researchers, podcast hosts, trainers, consultants, authors, etc. If you go on social media, there are neurodivergent clinical content creators everywhere, and the space is really getting really, really cool. So there are a lot of ways to gain more information. And those are the things that if you bring those into sessions with your ND clients, they're going to actually really appreciate it. They're going to probably like go deep diving with you about your learning. And I think that can be such a cool way to kind of join together and also really do some really creative work.
I agree. And what we see in our field is so many times therapists end up being sort of drawn to populations of people who have something in common with their own lived experience. We get that on the job training. And so there are lots and lots of therapists out there who work with the ND population who are themselves ND, which is, I think, a great thing. And we can learn a lot from them, but that doesn't mean they're the only ones who should be working with these clients.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the reality is they can't be, because if we're talking about a tenth or a quarter of the population, we're going to need neurotypical therapists to show up and learn and do the work too. So it is important to also recognize, like, it's not just neurodivergent therapists who are going to be doing work with neurodivergent people.
Right. And like you said, there's so many resources on social media these days. I know there's some pushback at times about that because there are people out there making all kinds of claims, but you can pretty quickly realize which are the ones that seem to really know their stuff, incorporating facts in with opinions and recommendations and that type of thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there are so many good resources. One book that I'm reading right now is by Dr. Donna Henderson. She's an ADHD psychologist and author, but she wrote a book called Is This Autism? And she does a really wonderful job of differentiating between autistic ADHD experiences, qualities, traits, tendencies, and then the overlap, because there is so much overlap and there's so much misdiagnosis. Dr. Megan Neff, who's my co-host on Divergent Conversations, another great person to follow, who not just puts out unbelievable content, including like Misdiagnosis Mondays, e-workbooks that are on special topics like autistic burnout, overlapping symptoms, misdiagnosis, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, all of these things. There's a lot of resources in the space right now. So I think if you're feeling like I really want to learn more, that's where you should invest your time, is in these things that you can really do deep dives in, but come away with good understanding and then tangible action steps that you can incorporate into your sessions as well.
Right. And I think that you and Megan are bringing so much value with the podcast that you're jointly hosting, because you're bringing the clinical perspective as well as the personal perspective, which is very, and I refer therapists in my consultation groups to your podcast all the time when they're curious, because you do, I think it's helpful to have both of those pieces, not just the clinical piece, but this is my lived experience and this is what this looks like in real life. The struggles with sleep and some of the other things y'all have discussed just have been really insightful for me.
Thank you. And that's a good point to make as well, is that lived experience is unbelievably validating, and self-disclosure is unbelievably helpful when you are working with neurodivergent clients. So if you are willing to self-disclose, if you're willing to share, hey, I struggle with ADHD, I'm autistic myself, or I struggle with A, B, and C, neurodivergent clients are going to be much more likely to build instantaneous rapport with you. And I think that's really important to recognize, because again, you mentioned the word gatekeeping. there's so much of the like therapist, we don't self-disclose, it's not about us. And it's like, yes and no. Like, yes, it's not about us, but no, that is not always true because sharing some of yourself is a very good, clinically sound way to build relationships, rapport, and trust, especially with neurodivergent clients.
I agree. And a lot of neurodivergent clients, if they've been in therapy before, have been with people who didn't really understand. And so, as a therapist, to be able to say, I work with a lot of women who were never diagnosed or late diagnosed, and to be able to affirm all of the self-esteem issues that they have from their childhood, and to be able to affirm I can understand this and give some examples. Self-disclosure is one of those things where my question to myself as I'm considering it is always, do I just want to say this or is this really helpful to the client? So if this is helpful to the client, absolutely share. And the relief that you see on their faces when they're like, oh, so you do really get it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. I think the same goes for like if you're working with people who are struggling with substance use and addiction, and you have some experience around substance use and addiction, self-disclosure is a really powerful tool because you'll see the expression just like, oh, you actually understand what it's like or what I'm going through. And that is a much more valuable intervention or technique than any training that you can take.
Agree. And that sort of reminds me, I remember years ago there was kind of this debate about if you haven't, experienced addictions, you shouldn't be working with that population. And I feel like we're kind of experiencing that a little bit with the ND population of people too, that if you're doing the work, like that lived experience can be really helpful, but you can also be very effective by learning and understanding and getting what that lived experience might look like for your client.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it's helpful to be able to incorporate lived experience when you are working with specific scenarios or situations or people, but that does not have to be a black and white thing. So if you don't have any neurodiversity and you're working with someone who does, that does not disqualify you from working and doing good work. But it is going to mean that you do have to put in the work to get a better understanding of your client's brain and how they've developed and the experiences that they've gone through.
You're right, right. And the things that are comorbid with it as well. We see a lot of depression and anxiety with people who are ND and understanding how all those pieces kind of fit together.
Yep. Yep. I always think about ADHD or autism as the foundations of your house, and then the trauma, depression, anxiety, etc. is kind of like the furniture, because foundationally, we just know from evidence by both lived experience and research that neurodivergent folks are typically more bullied, discriminated against, feel different, feel lonely, feel disconnected, or more prone to substance use, or more prone to suicide. So there's lots of other mental health struggles and concerns that are going on simultaneously. And I think it's just important to also acknowledge that as well.
And so the other thing that we're seeing a lot of, which is again, sometimes controversial, is because there is so much good information out there put out by people who really know their stuff that we're seeing more and more self-diagnosis. And there's for some communities of therapists and other medical professionals, there's some pushback on that self-diagnosis is not valid. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I imagine that the therapists that are saying self-diagnosis is not valid are also the therapists who are like, it's CBT or bust. But nevertheless, testing in a lot of ways is gatekeeping in our profession. You mentioned it before. It's expensive. People have unbelievably long wait lists. So I know that the people here in town are scheduling out into June of next year for testing. You might have to go through 3 or 4 long, lengthy sessions for a result. It is a permanent, lifelong diagnosis if you use your health insurance. There are lots of things to consider when we're thinking about testing. And a lot of our testing has been designed specifically for cishet white boys and males. So there's a lot of bias in testing too. I think self-discovery and self-diagnosis is really, really important, valid inherently within the neurodivergent community. And there are a lot of great self-screening testing tools out there. So I really don't think that the testing is the end all be all. I think you should pursue testing if you want to get that clinical diagnosis for a reason, whether it's for accommodation, like you mentioned before, or whether it's because for a lot of people, the diagnosis creates this like relief process. Even though there's a lot of grief built into it, there's a relief of like, oh, now I can finally understand and see the world through this lens that I did not have before. So those are my thoughts on testing.
I completely agree. Like I said, there's so many great resources out there to make these self-diagnoses. And who is it harming, really? If somebody is, if you want to pretend you're ADHD, autistic, and you're not, that's on you. But there's so much benefit for society, I believe, to own this. And against professional advice, when two of my three kids were being diagnosed, I said, and I simultaneously was being diagnosed, I said, we're going to own this. We're going to let people know that this is who we are, not as an excuse, as an explanation. And so many of their friends were like, wow, me too. I just was afraid to tell anyone. And it really opened up some really cool things in the schools where my kids were going and their experiences. And this, one of the professionals was told my middle school daughter, like, don't tell anyone. And I was like, when we got in the car, I was like, I don't agree. We're going to have a talk about this.
Yeah. It's a cool experience if you can get behind it with that mentality. And I think it's really powerful to have some identity and be able to identify what's been happening, because for a lot of people, that's what they're searching for, is like, why is it that I experience life the way that I do? And especially for autistic people, because autism and analytic minds go hand in hand. And there is this constant questioning of like, why is this how I am in social situations? Why is it this is how I feel when I leave this environment? Like, why am I experiencing these emotions? Why am I not experiencing being able to feel inside of my body? Like, people want those answers. So to be able to give yourself that answer, it is really empowering.
It is. It is. And it's beginning to normalize things for a lot of people as well, their life experience and the way they're showing up in the world. And for myself, I got a lot of pushback from family members when I was, initially kind of claiming this as who I am. Interestingly, if you just barely tap the family tree, there are all kinds of indie people that are going to fall out of it. And they just weren't ready to hear that and didn't want to hear that. But I just felt like it would be a disservice to try and hide this part of ourselves. We bring some really cool, unique things to the world. And, why not own that as well as the struggles that we sometimes have?
Yeah, for sure. I think that advocacy at its truest form is being able to openly speak about your struggles and the things that you experience, because a lot of people don't have that privilege or ability to do so safely. So I think it's really important when you are able to be able to talk about these things openly.
Right. And that's one of the reasons that I, even before the pandemic, really embraced telehealth, because it opened up opportunities for people who were never going to come into an office, who would have therapy sessions that no one had to know about. And they were in a safe space. They were in their home where they could feel comfortable and have the things around them that they needed. And it just was a wonderful way to really increase accessibility in a different way.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And I think for a lot of neurodivergent clients, telehealth is a great answer. And for a lot of neurodivergent therapists, telehealth is a really great answer, because the energy strain that people experience is completely different.
Right. Right. And there was, when I first went into telehealth before the pandemic, there was pushback that, you can't make that authentic connection, all the things that you can't do. But I had an experience early on where a client disclosed something to me that I'm sure very early on that I'm sure would have taken a lot longer for them to disclose in an office setting.
Yep.
And it also, for those of us who with the populations we're working with, we're getting that secondary trauma. It is a little bit helpful to have that a little bit of distance and being able to get up. And my office is in my house, so to leave a particularly hard session and go amongst my things and the things that are comforting to me versus sitting in an office trying to process everything has just happened before the next client comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what are some other things that you would suggest for someone who's thinking, okay, I want to learn more about this? So, there's podcasts, there's social media. I know that for myself, there's not currently that I know of some really, really great trainings out there for people who want sort of a primer on understanding neurodivergence. Are you aware of any of those?
Yeah, so Matt Lowry does a lot of good trainings, and he can find his information on social media. Dr. Megan Neff does a lot of master classes. Dr. Donna Henderson does a lot of master classes. Joel Schwartz was doing a lot of trainings. I'm not sure if he's still doing them at this point in time, but there are a lot of trainings out there. If you're going to go like the PESI route or whatever, because they're cheap, I would really look at the quality of the trainers, make sure that they are neurodivergent identifying trainers, because I think that makes a big difference in the information that's being relayed. But there are a lot of easy, accessible resources out there that you can do some basic 101 stuff pretty easily.
Right. And a lot of the people you've named, and Joel in particular, was hugely instrumental in my journey of understanding myself more in the population I was working with. A lot of them offer free resources as well. You don't have to spend a lot of money. Eventually, if you want to learn more, that you're going to probably want to invest in some of the things that they offer that are paid offerings, which you should. We should all be budgeting for those types of things in our continuing education. But most people that are offering those types of things are incredibly generous. They're putting out a lot of free stuff.
Yeah, lots of free stuff. And there are lots of good ways to piece together free information. Like the social media account Neuroclastic is really great. The ones I've already mentioned. I mean, there are so many good content creators right now that are clinicians or psychologists who have expanded their own clinical practices into that space. And it's a great way to get and absorb free content via videos they put out, static posts, worksheets, workbooks, all the things. And then in addition to their training. So really tons of opportunities if you are actually actively seeking them out. Dr. Devin Price is an autistic author and a professor and has the book Unmasking Autism. Really, really fantastic book. Highly recommend that, especially if you are thinking you might be autistic or you might know someone who you really care about who's autistic and you really want to learn more about that really in-depth lived experience.
Right, right. Those are great resources. Thank you for that. And then we also come to the lingo. You kindly corrected me at the beginning of a word I had made up. There's for a long time it was person first versus identity first, and there's some guidelines of what is sort of preferred within the indie community now. But basically, if you have your client coming in referring to them as person first and that's their preference, then we got to let them do that. It's them, their own identity. They get to choose what they want to do.
Yep. I'm a big believer in identity first language, especially with ADHD autism, because they are lifelong neurodevelopmental conditions that impact all areas of life. But like you said, if your client is identifying person first, it's not for me to change their mind. If they're open to a discussion about why identity language is really affirmative, sure, share it. But that's not something that I would initiate by trying to enforce my own belief on what is best practice, because I don't think that's my job to do that.
I agree. Yeah. That's important. The flexibility of allowing people to show up the way they are. And if they're open to some of those conversations and exploring what it might mean for them, not because it's considered a preferred term, but because it might benefit them in some way to use identity first. And that was a shift that I made. And I still sometimes fall back on, when I was initially diagnosed, I know I'm a person who has ADHD. And I'm like, no, ADHD is every part of my being. I am ADHD. And making that shift is really empowering. But I still fall back on those words at times because that was ingrained in me for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a big part of what we're talking about, trying hard to unpack and unravel. And I think that once you are able to and I see this more commonly in the autism spaces than ADHD, of people are really trying hard to own the identity around autism because of the negative stereotype and stigma that comes with that diagnosis. So I don't see it as much in the ADHD only spaces, but I do see it as like a big, big part of the autistic community. I had someone text me last night, like, hey, do you know of any ASD identifying providers in town? And I was like, okay, if I have to unpack this in a way where I can try to teach instead of respond with anger, because I think
Right.
that happens a lot of the time when we are a part of a marginalized community and we're trying to advocate. I was like, how could I identify as autism spectrum disorder? So now I have to really unpack that with this person. So I think language is really, really important. And I also think you want to come about it from a place of teaching and curiosity and learning, opposed to just like getting into that anger mode all the time, because that will destroy you if that's where you stay.
Absolutely. I so agree with that. And I think that there's different spaces out there for neurodivergent people. I love that there are some that say we really only want people to respond who have lived experience, or if you're going to respond, please identify if you have lived experience. And we're not going to tone police here. If person showing up authentically can't speak today and what they're saying seems abrupt or whatever for you, then maybe you need to take a step back and think, maybe it's me. Maybe this is who they are, and I'm reacting out of my own needs. And that's not helpful to anybody.
No, it's not. Yeah, I think this goes without saying in the therapist communities, but just trying really hard to come from an informative, gentle, curious place. And I know that we often do not do that, even in therapist spaces. So it's it's very important. I mean, you're never going to help someone change their mind, change their language if you approach things with aggression. It just doesn't work that way. People will get very entrenched in what they already believe. So I think it's just important to have open dialogue and conversation. And sometimes you're going to make mistakes. That's just the reality, especially when you're learning something new. So that's totally part of the process too.
Yeah. And something that was really powerful for me, and this was huge when George Floyd was murdered and everything blew up in the therapist social media spaces, basically. And I had to take a really hard look at myself and who I viewed myself as versus my own actions. And I have adopted this idea that if I'm feeling defensive about something, I need to keep my mouth shut and take a look at myself. Where is this coming from? And 99.999% of the time, it's a growth place for me. Okay, I need to learn more about this. If I'm defensive, then I need to take a step back. And that's proved invaluable to me. And I wish more people could embrace that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a invaluable lesson for sure.
Yeah. And it also kind of surprises me at times with some of the therapist spaces that I know for myself, I feel like I am such a less judgmental person the longer I'm in this field because you see the experiences that people have in their lives and the hurt and the pain and the trauma. And it's just so helpful to be able to be with people and remember, I don't know anything about what this person's life has been like. And so maybe I need to cut them a little bit of slack because they might just be having a bad day and I can easily smile if they're being rude or abrupt or whatever and move on about my business. Like you said, that anger can destroy you and it doesn't serve anybody.
I agree.
Well, is there anything else you would like to share? Any other thoughts that you have about therapists who are wanting to learn more, look more into serving this population?
No, I think we touched on the basics, and I think just seek out information, be curious, and we're supposed to be lifelong learners as it is. So I think that's just
Yeah.
important to continue to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree. And most of the therapists I know honestly are continually learning. They have just this strong curiosity and they want to learn what is the next thing that I'm going to focus my attention on and my time and my money.
For sure.
So, Patrick, do you have a favorite? Well, I know you do. Share with us, please, your motto that inspires so many people that I truly love.
So the motto that has really become my motto that I live my life by is doubt yourself, do it anyway. And that's just from my own personal lived experiences with so much self-doubt and perfectionism and imposter syndrome and insecurity at times. And I think we just are constantly holding ourselves back from pursuing the things that we feel passionate about or excited about. I really do try to live by that motto now. And I'm glad that you find it so inspirational.
I do. It just sums it up perfectly. You could put together a whole paragraph to get that point apart across, and you just sum it up so wonderfully. And you inspired me to develop my own motto as well. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Patrick, it's been so nice having you here. This has been a great conversation. We need to have more of these. I so appreciate the work that you do in the therapist spaces and in the neurodivergent community. And can you just tell the listeners where they can find out more about what you have to offer, the things that you do?
Yep. Since this is a neurodivergent specific podcast today, you can check out Megan Neff and my co-hosted podcast, Divergent Conversations, which is on all major platforms and YouTube. And if you want to hear my other podcast, you can listen to All Things Private Practice on all major platforms and YouTube. And if you are a therapist who is in private practice, wants to go into private practice, is in group practice, is entrepreneurial, whatever, you can join All Things Private Practice Facebook group as well.
Which is a really great one of the groups that I really feel comfortable in, because there's just not a lot of that garbage trash talk that happens in some of the other groups. It's nice to be able to look at what group am I actually in. Oh, okay, I can think differently in this group because the tone is different here, and that's so wonderful.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. For everyone listening, there are new episodes of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast released every Thursday on all major platforms. Please remember, our work is hard, but it does not have to be lonely. Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you loved this episode, please leave a review.